When we talk about Mage Knight in the board game community, this is the first and possibly only thing that comes to mind for most of us. Mage Knight, the board game, is one of the most popular board games ever made and has a huge following. But did you know there was a Mage Knight before Mage Knight? A game that kickstarted a completely new market and was poised to become the new Magic the Gathering? In this video, we'll be looking at the rise and fall of Mage Knight, or how board game publisher Wizkids killed one of the most successful miniature games ever.
Mage Knight, the world's first collectible miniatures game. Like collectible card games, Mage Knight is playable right out of the box.
A huge part of the board game hobby for me is to look for new games. I like to feed on top 100 recommendation lists for this or that kind of board game and build my own opinion based on those. I recently found Mage Knight in a list of underrated board games, and I thought, this has to be a mistake. If there's a game that's not underrated, it's Mage Knight. But then I realized it wasn't Mage Knight the board game, simply Mage Knight. A miniature game I had never heard about before, but which seems to hold a very special place in the heart of everyone who's played it. This time though, I had uncovered one of the saddest wastes of a great game in board game history. Wizkids launched Mage Knight in 2000. To my knowledge, it was the first collectible miniature game ever. Collectible Miniature Games, aka CMG, as the name implies, are tabletop games in which you collect miniatures. Think Magic the Gathering, but instead of cards, you get figures you can play with. CMGs are different from, for example, Warhammer 40k, because the booster sets you buy are randomized. You do not know what figures you'll get at the time of purchase. Again, we're talking something that's much more similar in concept to Magic the Gathering or Pokemon cards, rather than Warhammer 40k. That was a pretty new idea back in 2000. Another nice point of Mage Knight is that all miniatures, called warriors, come pre-painted. I know, for many of you painting the miniatures is the hobby, but having pre-painted miniatures is actually very appealing for lots of gamers. On top of the then novel idea of pre-painted collectible miniatures, Mage Knight had a few great innovations that made it an almost instant success in the gaming community. The gameplay is typically rapid, but often highly strategic, both in terms of traditional maneuvering and combat common to miniature games, and because of the unusual combinations of special abilities that make every army unique. If that sounds like Warhammer 40k to you, you're not entirely wrong. Tom Vassell of popular board game channel The Dice Tower even mentions Mage Knight as the game that made him transition from Warhammer 40k to board games. A huge part of Mage Knight's success was how simple the gameplay was. In particular, the game uses a patented dial system named clicks that progressively reveals hidden statistics about a given figure. The dial allows a figure's displayed statistics to change as it takes damage. This almost entirely eliminates the need to refer to rulebooks or sheets during the game, as everything you need to know about a given character is on the figure itself. But we'll see how this simplicity ultimately contributed to the death of Mage Knight. Shortly after its release, Mage Knight quickly gained in popularity, collecting many board game-related awards along the way. Between 2000 and 2005, Wizkids released 13 expansions for Mage Knight. That's not even counting video game adaptations and standalone expansions such as Mage Knight Dungeons. It felt like Wizkids were on top of the world with this game. They also organized tournaments for Mage Knight, and it was prominently featured at game conventions. In a 2006 review, Board Game Geek member Jason Ferris says, "There were these figures on horses, mechanical dragonflies, and mummified dragons. The game was surprisingly fun and only took about an hour to play. Within a few weeks, I was getting every figure I could find and desperately waiting for new ones to come out. It was plastic crack." So, as far as critical and commercial success was concerned, it seems Wizkids had the next Magic the Gathering on their hands. And it lasted this way for a few years. So what went wrong? Mage Knight ultimately disappeared for multiple reasons, but many people point to a significant event as the beginning of the end for the game. In 2003, card game manufacturer Topps bought Wizkids, and that seemed to have come with a lot of changes in the company's strategy. There's a lot of speculation going on regarding what happened to Wizkids after they got purchased by Topps. But at the end of the day, it sounds like the typical story of a bad company acquisition. People speculate that Topps tried to make Wizkids more profitable and that this ultimately led to the wrong decisions. Shortly after Wizkids was acquired by Topps, they announced Mage Knight 2.0. Some players say that the 2.0 launch is what doomed the franchise, but history seems to disagree. Looking back at the reviews from that era, it seems Mage Knight had already started to become a bit stale by that time. The 2.0 edition, which added some new rules and variety to the gameplay, was actually a welcome breath of fresh air for the game. Nonetheless, it didn't seem to be enough. In particular, it seems the gameplay suffered from balance issues, and 2.0 didn't fix that. For example, some of the most powerful figures in the game were limited edition figures that you could only get by winning tournaments or at conventions, or buy for an expensive price on the second-hand market. Most limited editions were more powerful than their normal counterparts, and the game began polarizing between haves and have-nots. Furthermore, the original simplicity of the game also meant it had little room to grow from a gameplay perspective. This meant that complex rules and edge cases had to be addressed by an FAQ, which quickly became too big for everyone except the most hardcore fans of the game. There was also growing competition in the world of collectible miniatures, with Wizards of the Coast's own Dungeons & Dragons miniature game launched in 2003. But also Wizkids' own different games based on the Clicks system. HeroClix in particular, possibly the most known CMG to date, was launched in 2002, so it's not impossible some of Wizkids' own games started diluting Mage Knight's popularity. In 2005, Wizkids announced that the Nexus expansion for the game would be the last one. By 2006, Mage Knight as a live game getting regular expansions was dead, and the final nail in the coffin was Topps closing Wizkids on short notice in 2008. A lot of games get a remake these days, and given the success of, for example, the HeroQuest reboot in 2021, it wouldn't be surprising to see a relaunch of some of Wizkids' older popular franchises. But to be fair, Mage Knight already had its second chance. In 2009, collectibles manufacturer NECA purchased the IP rights for Wizkids games. They released a new expansion for Mage Knight in 2013, Resurrection. Resurrection came out with two sets of rules to make it compatible with Mage Knight 2.0 or with Wizkids' more popular HeroClix game system. Unfortunately, this release only met a lukewarm reception, in part because Mage Knight fans had moved on a long time ago, but also because the Mage Knight or HeroClix game systems felt a bit outdated by modern board game standards. A 2022 review of HeroClix says, "Unfortunately, the combat mechanism is bland and the majority of special abilities are somewhat restrained and flat. That unsuccessful Resurrection expansion is probably why we haven't heard about Mage Knight, the collectible miniature game, in a long time." In the end, it's difficult to pinpoint a single mistake as the root cause of Mage Knight's downfall. At the end of the day, it boils down to a combination of competition from other games, an ill-fated acquisition, and maybe a game that tried to grow too big too fast, at the cost of gameplay balance. But it's actually unfair to call it a complete failure. The Mage Knight franchise is still extremely popular thanks to the board game of the same name. More importantly, the click style has been reused in many games from Wizkids for years, and some aspects of the collectible miniature game ecosystem that they designed are still alive, in particular with the HeroClix brand. As recently as 2022, a Marvel What If expansion to HeroClix has been released. The sealed boosters are now gone, and the expansion can actually be played as a standalone game. But when I look at the insane success of some collectible card games, I can't help but wonder if in the early 2000s, Wizkids wasted a huge opportunity to be the miniatures equivalent of Wizards of the Coast's MTG. Hey everyone, thank you so much for staying until the end of the video. It's a significantly different format from what I've been doing so far. What did you think? Should I make more of those? Less of those? Let me know in the comments, and see you next time.